You know, money is a frequently used metaphor in the New Testament. We speak about the kingdom of heaven as being treasured, buried in a field, and when somebody found it, sold everything to buy that field. Or the treasure is one fine pearl of such great value that people give up everything they have to chase after that pearl. Or we have the parable of the talents, where you're given 1, 3, 5, or 10 coins, and you're supposed to invest it in some way to serve the kingdom of heaven. It's a very common metaphor in the New Testament. And we hear it today in this reading from Ephesians, because I'm not going to touch that reading about Herod, not very much of it anyway. We hear about the riches of God's grace. We hear about inheritance, that we are going to inherit something from God, and inheritance is a financial metaphor. And we hear about redemption. Even the word redemption comes from a monetary understanding. Redemption was the amount of money paid to buy somebody's way out of slavery. Either they saved the money or somebody else saved the money and bought them freedom. These are all financial metaphors, which is why I want to talk about the riches of grace. And just as an aside, when Julie picks the music for Sundays, I actually don't really look at the music. I just say, gotcha, and Deanne puts it in the bulletin. Time after time, this happened at my other church too, it's not just us, but time after time, what I decide to preach upon is sung about throughout the entire Sunday. So she talks about grace, she talks about how am I going to follow you? Well, we're going to talk about the riches of grace. And the person who writes probably the most compellingly about grace is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. There are others, but he was pretty good at it. The 20th century German theologian died in prison, imprisoned by the Nazis for attempting to assassinate Hitler. He talks about grace in terms of cheap grace and costly grace. And this is written about most compellingly in a book called The Cost of Discipleship, which is a fantastic book. And if you're Christian, you should read it, but you should be prepared to be shaken down to your boots with the question, am I actually a disciple of Jesus? Cheap grace, he says, is proliferating in the world. It is the notion among Christians that because we are Christian, we're saved by the blood of Christ. And basically, no matter what we do in life, no matter how we live our life, no matter what happens to us, we're saved. Saved meaning when we die, we'll go to heaven. He says that is cheap grace. Because, ironically, grace should cost something. So he contrasts it with costly grace. And he says that if you're actually a disciple of Jesus, if you're actually following him, it's going to cost you something. Now, this is confusing because the other key teaching about grace, and Calvin and Dietrich Bonhoeffer are really good at explaining this, so is Augustine, is that it is absolutely free, just given by God, broadly, widely, throughout the world. Lots of people, probably beyond Christianity, but we don't know. Given as a gift to us, we cannot buy it, we cannot earn it, we cannot do lots of good things to be a good little Christian and then we'll get in. It is simply given by God in ways that we can't earn and don't deserve. So that's another key teaching about grace, that it's free. So if it's free, why does it cost? Huh? I wondered about that the last 3 days. Why does it cost something? Why is grace costly? Well, let's look at the story of Peter. Dietrich Bonhoeffer looks deeply at the story of Peter. And Peter is my favorite disciple. I identify most with him because he's such a bumbling bungler who wants so desperately to be a great disciple. And he loves Jesus, but he just keeps getting it wrong. And so I just sympathize with that. You want to be a good Christian, but boom, you keep tripping up. You keep tipping over. What he points out is that whenever Jesus calls Peter to follow him, both at the beginning and the end of Peter's ministry, Peter has to give something up. So, the first time he sees Peter having a successful catch, remember, because Jesus helped him have a successful catch. So here's a successful businessman, the great fisherman, has a team of fishermen helping him on his boat, and Jesus says, "Come, follow me. I will make you fishers of people." Now, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it becomes clear that Peter leaves his home, his wife, his mother-in-law, his business, his boat, everything he has ever known to follow Jesus. And he follows him with abandon, right? He says, I'll go wherever you go. I'll do whatever you tell me. Well, as we know, Peter kind of blows it. On that fateful night, he denies Jesus 3 times. And then near the end of Peter's ministry, the risen Christ comes to him. This is at the end of the book of John, my favorite chapter, I think, in the Bible, the beach party. Jesus is on the beach frying fish. The men are on the boat fishing. The disciples are on the boat fishing. And Jesus calls to them, and Peter realizes it is Jesus, and with that loving abandon, jumps into the water, swims to the shore, and then begins that conversation. Peter, do you love me? Yes, I do. Feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, you know I do. And Jesus says, then feed my sheep. Then the 3rd time, Jesus asks, do you love me? And Peter says, why do you keep asking me? I've told you twice already. I love you. And then Jesus says, then feed my sheep. And then he goes on to say, you are going to go where you don't want to go. You are going to be bound in a way you don't want to be bound. And then Peter starts to get that queasy feeling that he's going to have to go all the way to the cross. And he says, why not the other one? He points to the beloved disciple, we assume is John, but we don't really know, the unnamed disciple, and says, why are you saying that to me? Why not him? And Jesus says, don't worry about him. You come, follow me. It cost Peter dearly. It did cost him his life eventually. It cost him his good standing in the Jewish community. He was stoned. He was jailed. He didn't think he was a good speaker. He had to go up in front of judges and, Pharisees and tell them that they were wrong, that they had crucified the wrong man. It cost him. It hurt him. He did not get to have the life that everybody else had in the world. He gave it all up. So I was reflecting upon this story recently. I was thinking, really, you have to read this book because you sit there going, good Lord, have I ever been a disciple? Have I ever followed Jesus? It just really shakes you. And then I remembered that when I was a young woman, fairly newly divorced, there was a magic time economically in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, one of the most expensive real estate markets in the nation, when interest rates were extremely low and the prices were really low, and I'd been getting gradual raises at work as a single working parent, and I was able to buy a house. And I thought, aha, I've done the thing you're supposed to do. What are you supposed to do to succeed? If you can, you buy a house. That's the thing. That makes you, like everybody else, a good person, successful. And that house gained in value, and then I sold it and moved to a house, Sacramento area. That gained in value. And then I sold that to move to, it's a long story, but why I sold it. But I moved to another house in the Sacramento area. And then I was finally approved to go to seminary in 2009. And what happened in 2009? The market crashed. So I thought, fine, I'll rent my home, because you got to have a home, right? I rented my home. I was going to rent my home so that when I got out of seminary, my daughter and I would still have a home to go to. But the market had fallen so badly that people could no longer afford their mortgages in the Bay Area, and the rental market was flooded with homes. And even with my very small mortgage payment, I would be unable to rent my home and keep paying the mortgage. So I was going to have to sell it and lose a bunch of equity. And I thought, so what? So what? I'll do it for God. I also had to sell my Steinway piano. I'm a classical pianist. That is the creme de la creme if you want to play a classical piano. And I had bought one. And there was really no way to transport it, to keep it, to care for it properly. Nobody in my family had room to store it. So I said, fine, for God, I will sell my piano. What a disciple. And I thought, I'll always be in the presence of pianos, tons of pianos and organs at Yale. There'll always be a piano at a church that I can play. It's no problem. I don't need to own the piano. Well, when I got to seminary, it turned out I was pretty miserable without a piano. I would occasionally go to the music practice rooms, but I don't actually like people listening to me playing scales and arpeggios and mistakes. I don't like that. I don't even like playing it well. I don't like playing in front of people at all. So I really didn't do it very much, didn't play very much. And it stung. It stung all the time. And I thought, gosh, I wish I'd have figured out a way to say that. Oh, well. The home didn't really. But when I was in seminary, a church leader from California came to visit me and other seminarians from our diocese and was introducing me to some other church person, some other priest who had come along on the visit. And I was standing, she found me in the divinity school library, and she came and introduced me, and she said, you know, she sold her home in California. She can never come back. And that just went right into my head, like, shoo. And I thought, oh, I'm coming back. And I'm going to have that house. Now, why? Why would I do that? The fact is, I've been a single homeowner for half of my adulthood. I always found it stressful. I worried about the water heater, the sprinkler system, the broken pipe, the this, the that. It's stressful. I don't like taking care of them. It's not that I couldn't take care of it. I didn't want to. And yet, because other people had said that what you do as a good parent, as a good earner, as a good American is you buy a home. So, coincidentally, it just so happened that when I was done with seminary, I searched all over the country for a job, except the Deep South. But other than that, all over, Midwest, Northwest, Northeast, you name it. And I got called by a church in California, hallelujah, back near my home family, my entire extended family's in the Bay Area. I thought, fantastic. Lived in a small apartment, happy. Didn't have a piano, unhappy. Somebody gave me a little spinet to play, and they kind of make a plinky-planky sound. They're okay, but it doesn't do what this does, not really. So what? Second job, got called here. I mean, San Diego's even better, really, than LA. It's even better. I have a lovely home, which you have provided for me to live in. Perfect. And then, pure chance, I was scrolling Facebook one night, soon after I moved here, had that little spinet in the living room, and somebody that I'd gone to school with, I grew up with in my childhood, who still lives in my old neighborhood, said that he had been given a piano to give away, that he took care of. He was a contractor who fixed up homes when people were preparing to sell them. And an elderly woman had died, and her children did not want to keep this amazing 1917 Chickering piano, which has the same sound quality as a Steinway. And he said, does anybody want it for free? I said, I want it. First person, I will take it. So this piano just literally dropped from the sky, got delivered in my home. I now have that piano. But what I also have is the memory of the sting of not having it. And then the amazing feeling of luck and grace of one just falling, literally, into my home. What an amazing gift that was. Still, that little worm in my head was saying, she said, you'll never be back in California. She said, you'll never have a home. So I had a talk with my financial planner, just a kind of a yearly review of, am I taking care of myself? And he said, and so what are your plans? And I said, well, I'm thinking that when I retire, I would like to buy a home again. I don't want to do it before I retire, but when I retire. So the only problem is my entire extended family, all my old childhood friends, live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is, that's crazy, right? And I said, it's a very expensive real estate market, so I'm just wondering, what do I need to do? And he goes, why do you want to? Why wouldn't you rent? And I thought, well, that's an interesting question. Why wouldn't I? And he said, with renting, you have the freedom. First of all, it is less money per year, but also you have the freedom of moving wherever you want to move. And I said, well, that's true because I hope someday to be a grandmother, and it's possible that there'll be a grandchild somewhere else in the country, and I may want to live near that grandchild. Huh! And he said, it also means you could, you have flexibility, Judy. You could do this or that, but if you buy a home, actually, you can't. You're sort of locked in. And all of a sudden, I realized that I'd had this thing in my head planted first in that notion in my young adulthood, and then by that church leader in the Divinity Library saying, she can never come back to California. I thought, well, I am in California living very happily, and I actually don't need a little postage stamp size of land in the Bay Area in my retirement. And all of a sudden, I felt this lifting happen. There's a funny thing that happens with the world. The world tells us what success looks like, what a happy life looks like, where we need to be, how much needs to be saved for us from retirement, all these things. And yet, none of those things actually have to do with being a disciple of Jesus. Now, that does not mean that there's anything wrong with disciples owning homes, renting homes, owning multiple homes, being rich, being poor. It actually doesn't matter. There are many stories in the Bible of people living along the spectrum from poverty to riches, and God blessing all of them along the way. It's what people do in their poverty or their wealth or their middle classness that matters to God. It's whether there's a sting in their life. The sting of not having a piano for a while and then having it was realizing that I simply needed to trust upon God's providence. And somehow I'd have my little private piano experience. I'd be back in my home again. I wouldn't have to play in front of everybody. And boom, I wasn't expecting it, not looking for it. And then it just came. That is how grace happens. But what Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others are telling us is that grace costs something, that grace needs to be balanced with discipleship, not pretending to be Christian, but actually following Jesus. So I want to give you an image from our Tai Chi class, our first Tai Chi class yesterday. We learned about balance, so you're supposed to space your feet out a foot's width, your own foot's width, and be balanced, perfectly balanced on your left and your right side. And what Dietrich Bonhoeffer is saying is that you get grace from God, but there's a response of discipleship. If we rely solely upon God's grace, I can balance for 45 seconds when nobody's watching, but when people are watching, I always tip over. We're going to fall over. If we depend solely upon our being good little Christians and not relying upon God's grace, oh, I'm doing it longer, we tip over. We need both of them. That grace is going to cost us something. The thing is, I don't know what it's going to cost you because it's different for everybody. What I do know is that it should jostle you in some way, that your expectations of what your life is going to look like is going to change in some way. It's going to sting in some way, the way it stung Peter to hear that he was going to have to go farther than he was going to go. What has grace cost you?